Good morning, everyone. Welcome to PYA Summer CPE Symposium, Hot Topics in Healthcare, Day 1. I'm Catherine Good, an Audit and Assurance Principal, and on behalf of PYA, I'm pleased to welcome you to our 5th annual Summer CPE Symposium. PYA is happy to present these complimentary virtual learning opportunities for our healthcare colleagues across the country. Over 2 days, PYA thought leaders will present a total of 4 sessions on trending topics and provide key takeaways and helpful tools for you and your organizations. Today's presentations are the Aligned Assurance Model, Transforming Oversight into Insight, and OBBBA Impacts, Medicaid Cuts, and State Tax Implications. With that, I'll hand it over to our moderator for CPE information.
Thank you, Catherine. As this event is for CPE credit, there are some additional steps that we'll take in order to comply with NASBA's requests. In accordance with NASBA, attendees will be provided with 3 polling questions during this session. Responses are documented electronically. Attendees must respond to these polling questions within the allotted time in order to receive CPE credit. At the close of the session, a post-event survey will also be provided for attendees to submit feedback regarding their webinar experience. The polling questions and post-event survey must be submitted for proof of participation today. Credits will only be earned for sessions attended in their entirety. Your CPE certificates are downloadable via the Continuing Education pane once you've completed all the requirements. We've posted a PDF copy of the presentation slides for your reference in the Resources pane. Also, all of the sessions will be recorded, and you'll receive an email later today with a link to a copy of the slides and a recording of the webinar. You may submit questions directly to today's presenter by typing a message into the Q&A pane. We'll collect these, and the presenter will address them individually via email after the event. Registration is still open for the remaining summer symposium sessions, and we hope you'll join us. For more information and to register, visit the Thought Leadership section of our website at pyapc.com. With that, I'd like to introduce our Session 1 presenter, Andrew Sizemore.
Hello, I'm excited to be here and happy to kick off session number 1. I'm Andrew Sizemore, and I'm a senior manager here at PYA. I sit in our risk advisory group. And for those who aren't familiar with risk advisory, we support clients through strengthening and assessing internal controls, as well as supporting internal audit and enterprise risk objectives. With that said, all of that lends some credibility to the topic today, which is aligned assurance. So before we go ahead and jump in, why don't we start with our agenda? So overall today, we're going to spend some time talking about the aligned assurance model, and we're going to tie the model back to the 3 lines of defense model. We're going to talk through common challenges that groups face when they work in silos. We're also going to discuss why aligned assurance is important for every single function in the business, and we're going to take this down to a tactical role level. We're then going to speak through practical steps to go ahead and implement aligned assurance at your organization. And then finally, we're going to wrap up with benefits on how alignment strengthens emerging risk response. As I go through, I'm going to conceptually give you some ideas about aligned assurance, but please know that you're certainly free to tailor this approach to what works best for your organization. And so as noted, we're going to go ahead and jump in with first the definition of aligned assurance. So what is aligned assurance? At the highest possible level, aligned assurance is a structured approach of coordinating assurance activities across the 3 lines of defense. I know for a fact in today's session, we have a number of members across various lines of defense shown here on the screen. So I'm going to go ahead and give a refresher as to what each line of defense represents. So we'll start with the first line of defense. The first line of defense is responsible for owning and managing risk on a day-to-day basis. So individuals who sit in the first line of defense include business operations, financial reporting, accounting, IT operations, human resources. All of these individuals are subject matter experts in their area and actually carry out day-to-day activities such as designing and operating controls. So the first line, while not performing assurance directly, is directly contributing to assurance activities. The second line of defense ultimately is tasked with overseeing risk and compliance. The second line of defense includes those who sit in groups such as compliance, risk management, and quality. Ultimately, they're significantly contributing to emerging risk topics, ongoing monitoring of results, program effectiveness. All of these items sit in the second line of defense. And also, they're beginning to start to do some testing of first line activities. And finally, we have the third line of defense. The third line of defense represents independent assurance or internal audit. Why is the third line independent? Well, the third line is independent because they directly administratively report up through the audit committee, which is a subsection of the board. Additionally, they are not operating controls on a daily basis, and therefore they are able to come in with an objective lens and point out when controls are operating effectively or need improvement. So again, the three lines of defense model is critical to today's discussion. I do want to go ahead and point out that while we're talking about coordinating efforts across these three lines, by no means are we talking about blurring any of the accountability. These distinct functions will continue to live on as intended. We're just talking about having more open dialect and dialogue across these three lines. Of note, external audit is not on this screen. However, certainly should be folded into the mix. What's on the screen just represents those who are employed directly by your organization. And so at this point, you're probably wondering, if aligned assurance is simply about open dialogue and having communications with coworkers, why is this such an important topic? Well, it's not that straightforward, and we're going to go ahead and root this into data. So on the screen, I have some results from a 2025 survey performed by 850 audit and assurance professionals. So when I say audit and assurance professionals, I'm referring to those who are very familiar with emerging risk topics and how to essentially approach this topic of aligned assurance. So let's dive in with what they found. The first thing that sticks out to me was that misalignment is actually the norm. So of the 850 participants, only 16% of those participants acknowledged that their organizations are effectively fully aligning risk management across the various functions. If you flip the script, that means that an overwhelming over 80% of these participants are acknowledging that there is misalignment. And misalignment doesn't necessarily mean dysfunction. In most cases, these various functions are actually operating very successfully as intended. They simply aren't having broader awareness outside of their own groups. And we'll get to that here in a little bit. So what does this lead to? This ultimately leads to duplicative efforts, whether it's testing or planning activities. And specifically, the survey found that 40% of the participants noted a struggle with duplicative assurance activities. It goes on to state that 64% maintain multiple risk libraries. Why is that important? We'll talk about this a little bit more later, but risk libraries ultimately are the starting point for any sort of work plan in a given year. So if we're acknowledging that the first step is performing a risk assessment based on our existing risk libraries, and we're acknowledging that each function has their own risk library, we're all starting off on different feet as we start to walk together. 56% of the survey participants indicated a strong or critical need for greater alignment and communication. Notice how this doesn't say some further alignment needed. It says strong or critical alignment. So this is clearly a hot topic in today's world. And finally, 31% noted that they lacked a common risk taxonomy, which is the way that risks are ultimately grouped and categorized. And 50% acknowledged that they're actually using different rating methodologies. What this means to me is even if they were using the same risk library, the lens in which they're viewing risk is vastly different, even down to the scoring. And so you can start at the same point, but actually come up with different outcomes. And we're going to tackle that in today's session. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and tackle the problem. So we're going to take those statistics that we just saw and tie them back to actual problems that you see on a day-to-day basis. We'll start with assurance fatigue. So this typically pops up for those in the first line of defense. These are those people who are ultimately fielding audit requests and discussions. So typically this includes those in finance and accounting teams. You're probably very familiar with this. Throughout the day and throughout the year, throughout your given cycle, you're going to have multiple parties approach you multiple times for essentially the same information. So this is very disruptive to your workflow. The work isn't the actual issue, it's the lack of coordination around that work. We typically find that individuals in the first line of defense are more than happy to contribute their subject matter expertise towards addressing risk. We just need to find a better way to approach this to cause less disruption. And less disruption means more effective communication up front. The next issue is inconsistent risk assessment. So as previously acknowledged just a little bit, audit, compliance, risk, and finance tend to have their own risk frameworks, scales, and terminology. So effectively, each group is performing a risk assessment in order to develop a thought around what their work plan should be for the year. So if everybody is approaching this differently, there's no surprise that the results are ultimately inconsistent. And that ultimately is going to bleed into the next two problem statements on the screen. So siloed reporting. Everyone, as I just acknowledged, is doing their own risk assessment. However, they're also coming up with their own reports. And I want to point out that reports maintain key insights. However, what we find is that those insights are actually trapped within your respective work stream typically. And this is due to a lack of communication on a broader level. So leadership, the board, and each function are only actually seeing a fragmented snapshot instead of a unified risk view of what's actually taking place. And finally, we see gaps and blind spots. This again builds upon the three first statements that I have on the screen. But at the end of the day, when we focus so much attention on the same areas, we ultimately have areas that receive little to no attention. And this is something we need to work to address. Everything we do should be done intentionally, and we should be working to address areas that present the most risk in an organization. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the solution. Rather than repeat the issue statements, we're going to focus on this slide on what good looks like. So what are we going to work towards as we approach this shift? So ultimately, at the end of the day, we need to work towards shared intelligence across functions. Those insights that we just noted, we need to start sharing those across our groups in order to have a unified risk lens. We ultimately, in part of that, need to have a unified risk view for leadership. So as we start to share information, leadership is going to get one clear picture about what risk looks like, and in turn, they're going to be able to make better decisions. And then lastly, we're going to move towards insight-driven coordination. On this, I will pause and say we're moving from activity-based assurance, which to me means check the box activity. We're going to move away from simply doing activities just to acknowledge that we do them towards doing them with intent and doing them with more upfront planning. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and pause for polling question number 1.
Thank you, Andrew. Our first question is, how would you describe assurance activities at your organization today? Highly coordinated across departments, some coordination, but mostly informal, largely independent and siloed, minimal assurance outside of internal audit, or not sure. Remember, you must answer the polling questions to receive CPE credit. You will have 30 seconds to answer. Okay, thank you for participating in our poll. Now back to Andrew.
All right, and I'm looking at the results right now, and I would say statistically we were aligned with the survey results. So about 20% acknowledge that they feel like there's a highly coordinated aligned assurance method already in place, which closely correlates with that 16% However, the majority of people acknowledge that there is some coordination. However, it's a little bit more informal. And so at this point, I'm going to go ahead and take the discussion down to a more tactical role-based level. And so we're going to go ahead and jump in with finance and accounting. So again, finance and accounting individuals sit in the first line of defense. As I acknowledged, ultimately, these individuals tend to feel some of the most pain from friction and lack of coordination. So I want to cover in each role what these individuals are both contributing and what they're set to gain from implementing these activities. So we'll jump in with contributions. As we acknowledged, finance and accounting personnel ultimately are subject matter experts in their areas. So what are they bringing to the table? They're bringing process walkthroughs and documentation. Practically what this looks like is they may sit down with internal auditors, members from enterprise risk, or external auditors, and they may be asked to share their screen or provide sample support. And all of this supports the operating effectiveness and design of control activities. So they're dedicating their time to bring other parties up to speed on what they spend their day-to-day basis doing and tackling. They're also, as we just acknowledged, ultimately performing the controls, which may include items such as reconciliations and review activities. And then lastly, their insight into financial reporting risks and operational processes. So not only are they performing direct audit activities, but these individuals are also providing critical risk-based information as it pertains to financial reporting. So I think I mentioned this earlier. You might be sitting here thinking finance and accounting are not providers of assurance. However, they certainly are contributors. And so what we need to work towards is bringing finance and accounting to the table when we start planning out our work plan for the year and having ongoing updates. So with that said, we're going to go ahead and move into what finance and accounting is set to gain from aligned assurance. So the first one directly ties to assurance fatigue. They are set to gain reduced audit disruption and fewer repeat walkthroughs. This certainly takes a little bit of upfront coordination, which is what this is all about. However, if the other parties who need information from finance and accounting can get on the same page, we can actually ask fewer questions while leveraging more of the content that's already being provided. This goes into the next point, which is greater reliance on existing documentation and control activities. So in many cases, what finance and accounting personnel may tell you is that they're being asked to provide the same information to different parties. However, they're being asked to package that just slightly differently. So if we can get everybody to align on what is needed in coordination with this activity, essentially accounting and finance should be able to maybe add a few more attributes or key activities to what they're doing in order to allow a greater number of parties to place reliance on the activities they are already naturally performing. And then finance and accounting is set to gain more predictable timing of audit and compliance activities. So we all know that those who sit in finance and accounting have set busy periods throughout the year. We know that it's the end of the month, it's the end of the quarter, and it's the end of the year. So we need to move from a retroactive approach to a proactive approach when we consider when we speak with these individuals. And so this is going to ultimately help with the bullet point number 1 here under gains, which is reduced audit disruption. If we can sit down and coordinate and say, we need to speak to finance, here's what we need to cover, and when does this work best for you all in finance, we can ultimately get to that more predictable timing and avoid those busy periods to the degree possible. And finally, we're going to see clear visibility in how audit, risk, and compliance efforts ultimately impact those in finance. And we'll cover this a little bit more here in a bit. So next, we're going to shift to compliance. Just a refresher, compliance individuals sit in the second line of defense. So what that means is their contributions are vastly different from those in finance and accounting. So what are compliance individuals contributing to aligned assurance? Well, they're contributing their ongoing monitoring results and regulatory testing outcomes. So as we acknowledged, these individuals are sitting down and performing some detailed tests and they're performing tests over items being ultimately owned and managed in the first line of defense. So they're going to provide these testing outcomes to the broader aligned assurance effort. They're also going to be contributing their specialty knowledge on regulatory intelligence and emerging compliance requirements. They have a great depth of knowledge on these topics, and they all directly feed into risk assessment as it occurs on an ongoing basis. And then finally, most people in compliance are actually contributing their own compliance risk assessment. So rather than one broad risk assessment, compliance is narrowly focusing and taking their risk assessment very deep on specific topics. However, those topics are equally as important to the whole risk picture, and therefore their risk assessments and their effectiveness evaluation results are being contributed to the overall enterprise risk picture at the end of the day once we implement aligned assurance. So what is compliance set to gain? Well, they're going to have greater visibility with the board through integrated reporting of compliance findings. So once we start to complement compliance findings with other risk-based findings, we're going to have a bigger picture and a more unified view of risk for the organization. And more parties are going to be speaking the same language, which just means the outcomes are going to have a louder voice by the time they make it to the board. They also are set to gain some reduced duplication where compliance and audit may have testing overlap. So again, if we can sit down and determine what specifically needs to be tested, how many items need to be tested, what are the specific attributes that need to be covered, we can actually sit down and say there is an ability to rely on the same information, and it all just requires upfront coordination, but it's very worth it in the end. They're also gaining a critical seat at the assurance planning table, which means coordinating scope and priorities. So as we know, things tend to change throughout the year. However, what this means to me is that compliance is able to gain broader awareness of what is taking place in other functions throughout the organization in order to best manage their own work plan. And finally, compliance is set to gain stronger influence on how regulatory risks are communicated to leadership. So let's go ahead and move on to risk management. So those who sit in enterprise risk. Once again, these individuals sit in the second line of defense. When I think about contributions, this group actually has a very strong contribution to this whole approach. And that's the fact that they are experts on risk by default. And so this group ultimately is set to provide the backbone for aligned assurance efforts. And when I say the backbone, it's the individual items listed under contributions. So we'll start with enterprise risk assessments and risk appetite frameworks. So an enterprise risk assessment ultimately is a very broad view of risk. It should be covering risk across the entire organization. Unlike compliance or audit, again, this covers a little bit of everything and takes it to a deep level. And this is ultimately something that's already being performed. So this contribution is very straightforward. Enterprise risk is ultimately providing risk taxonomy and consistent rating methodologies across the organization as well. So as they are the ones who maintain the subject matter expertise on risk, they have consistent ways to rate risks. And they also have a clear risk taxonomy in place. And so contributions here ultimately appear to say, here's my way that I view risk, and here's how I define it. For example, low risk is defined as an impact of $25,000 or less. And they're able to sit down with the other groups and collectively come up with a better picture of what risk looks like and how it is defined. And finally, they're contributing cross-functional risk context that ultimately connects operational, financial, compliance, IT, and various other risks in the organization. So again, the way they view risk ultimately has some interconnections behind the scenes across the various functions, and they're providing broader awareness to the overall aligned assurance group. So what does risk management gain as they're ultimately already performing many of these activities? Well, when they start to coordinate with groups such as compliance and audit, risk management is gaining a more complete enterprise risk picture, and they're informed by audit and compliance findings. So naturally, enterprise risk is considering control implementation with what they're doing. However, when they start to partner with audit and compliance, who again are performing testing, we can take those results and ultimately have a clearer picture into the actual accurate residual risk, or the risk that exists after controls. And so ultimately, again, this provides a more complete enterprise risk picture. They're also set to gain assurance priorities that become driven by enterprise risk assessment rather than separate function plans. So once we all start to get on the same page and speak the same language, ultimately we can start using enterprise risk assessment as the starting point, which is going to provide more consistency throughout programs and throughout the year. Enterprise risk also gains stronger influence on governance through a unified risk narrative for leadership. So again, once we start reporting the same findings and we're all approaching it in a similar manner, the data ultimately is going to support better governance decisions. That's what this gain is all about. And then finally, hand in hand with that, enterprise risk is going to gain greater credibility when it comes to risk data, as it's corroborated across multiple assurance functions. So once we get our data on the same page, we're going to have greater credibility when it comes to our findings. And then finally, from a role perspective, we're going to wrap up with internal audit. One clear distinction, what I typically see at an organization, and this typically works successfully, is that internal audit actually owns the administrative function, typically, of aligned assurance activities. So when I say the functionality, these individuals are actually owning maybe the setup of the meeting, setting the agenda in advance, and maybe some takeaway items. It doesn't mean that they're responsible for owning all of aligned assurance. They're just tasked with some of the structure behind it, as somebody needs to step up and get the ball rolling. So what is internal audit contributing to this process, and what are they set to gain? Well, as we acknowledged, they are ultimately testing processes and controls. So internal audit is going to contribute their independent assurance findings and objective evaluations of control effectiveness. Next, they're set to contribute their evaluations that validate or challenge management's risk assertions. So again, because they are objective by nature, they can come in and say, I see that you've identified this risk as moderate. However, in my own experience from testing that I performed and discussions that I've had, I would actually challenge you to move that to high, and here's why. So again, we're going to get a better risk picture as we're going to push back or validate what's existing in terms of how risk exists and how it's defined. And then finally, they are going to contribute objective risk validation that provides the board with an unbiased perspective. Again, internal audit is not performing any control activities by design, and therefore their objective results are very valuable to the board as they are unbiased. So what does internal audit gain from aligned assurance? Well, they're going to gain better intelligence for audit planning through shared risk data and compliance insights. So what that means is that internal audit is going to take existing information and insights and be able to better develop a risk-based audit plan for the entire year. They are also going to gain an ability to rely on second-line work and ultimately be able to reduce redundant testing of monitored areas. So again, we've already talked about this a little bit, but a little bit of upfront coordination goes a long way in cutting down on the quantity of work that needs to be performed. So this doesn't mean that we're cutting out tests entirely. It simply means that maybe we sit down and say, I was set to test 25 items. You were set to test 25 items. They're ultimately the same item at the end of the day. How can we sit down and align on exactly what is needed so that I can re-perform the work you're doing, and ultimately the business is only getting requests for 25 items rather than a total of 50. Internal audit is also set to gain a more strategic focus by redirecting limited resources to the highest risk areas. No shock here, internal audit, like all other functions, has limited resources in hand. So by speaking the same language and getting a better picture of where risk lives in an organization, internal audit can ultimately address this by assigning specific resources to those areas that produce the most risk and assessing where gaps exist and pointing resources to those areas. And then finally, in a similar vein, internal audit is going to gain enhanced credibility with the board. Of note, obviously, our findings here at the end of the day are going to get a louder voice, as we've already established, once multiple parties are saying the same thing. We already have individuals who are very credible with the board. However, aligning all of these activities is going to give one unified view on risks and findings. And so in conclusion in this section, aligned assurance is about coordination, again, not consolidating efforts. As seen on the screen, we have a boat with multiple parties rowing. We need to work towards rowing in unison in order to better support the organization's objectives as a whole. We need to work towards one shared risk language, not one shared department. We need to work towards findings and intelligence across the various functions, not just within your own silo. We also need to work towards function plans that have awareness of what others are doing, not in isolation. And then we also need to work towards deliberate and risk-based assurance coverage. So with that said, we need to move from concept to implementation. And we're going to start with a broader roadmap, a maturity roadmap. And so when I think of a maturity roadmap, I think of a continuous process that certainly may take some time. I don't know that anybody ever truly perfects this. There's always going to be more room for improvement. However, you do need to start somewhere. So there are 3 distinct phases in the roadmap I've presented on the screen. We'll start with phase 1, which is ultimately the foundation for aligned assurance. The foundation begins with inventorying providers. When I say inventorying providers, I know I've already covered a number of the parties who sit at the aligned assurance table. However, in your own organization, this may not be the complete picture. There very well could be others in the organization who play a critical role in aligned assurance. You need to sit down and tailor this message to what works best for your organization. And before you can have those discussions, you need to get a complete picture of who needs to be at the table. We also need to start aligning risk universe. As we noted, the various parties tend to have their own risk libraries. So we need to start taking these risk libraries and ultimately coming up with one master risk universe. And I'll give you a key here. Artificial intelligence is very useful for this step, to the degree that your organizations allow the use of artificial intelligence and the findings stay within your organization's walls and boundaries. So tactically, you need to go out to each group that's performing a risk assessment. You need to ask for their risk inventory and or most recent risk assessment report. And you need to start finding common threads across those risk inventories to create one master risk universe. Before we can truly assess risk on a common view, we need to pull all of these things together and just figure out what's taking place and start drawing big circles of overlap. Next is phase 2, which is coordination. This is where we actually start to sit down and align our work plans. So again, we need to sit down and acknowledge across our various silos that we've developed a work plan. We need to say, I was set to view an area such as accounts payable. What's on your work plan? I have 3 areas of overlap. We should really start having functional discussions about how we can coordinate. It all starts with open discussion, but we need to start someplace. And next, we need to start working towards standardized reporting. And so what this means is we're not going to cut out reports. Reports are still a very important process to each of these functions across the entire aligned assurance approach. However, our reports need to start communicating some of the same key elements. So how do you do this? Similar to aligning risk universe, you need to start collecting reports to the degree that it's appropriate and necessary. And you need to figure out the key elements that go on in those reports and ensure that we're defining areas such as risk in the same manner. Ultimately, this is going to allow us to report a common message up through leadership and the board. And finally, phase 3 is optimization. And when we talk about optimization, I want to think about sustainability. So whatever we set in motion today needs to be a long-term view. This needs to live on for a very, very long time. And so this is all about continuous collaboration. We need to implement processes and committees and discussions that can live on past just those who are involved today. So if there's turnover, we need to have consistency and follow through in the future. We also need to make sure that we are collectively gathering updates multiple times throughout a given year in order to get the best results. We also need to work towards integrated reporting to leadership, and we'll cover that on the next slide. But that means that we need to have one common channel in which we're taking our findings and pushing them up to leadership and the board. So now we're going to move from big picture roadmap down to tactical bite-sized recommendations. And these are all built on what I see as successful at clients that I work with, and what I've personally experienced in my time that I actually spent prior to PYA in a first line of defense. So we're going to start with recommendation number 1. You need to begin with high risk or high visibility areas where we know there's bound to be multiple functions already overlapping. So areas that come to mind for me are areas like accounts payable, revenue, procurement, or user access. We simply need to pick an area to start with, and we need to start somewhere. This feeds directly into recommendation number 2. Once we've identified that area to start with, we need to simply begin our pilot. And once we pilot, we need to bring at least 2 functions to the table and start our coordination efforts. So, for example, if audit and compliance are set to evaluate the same area, and that's what we picked out in recommendation number 1, we need to bring the full teams who are set to evaluate that area to a common discussion. And we need to start talking through everything from planning. Who are we talking to? When are we planning to talk to this group? What are we asking for? What are the objectives? And what is the output? At this stage, we should ultimately be providing hard and fast materials as well. So it's one thing to simply talk about it, but for example, we need to bring our request list to the table. We need to start coordinating on individual steps in order to cut out some of that duplicative activity. As far as testing goes, we also need to jump in and start here and acknowledge where we can maybe place reliance on testing. And to place reliance on testing, we need to understand who's going to be performing the testing, what they're testing, and how many items they're testing at a minimum. Recommendation number 3 is to leverage existing governance forums. And so when I talk about existing governance forums, it's perfectly acceptable to leverage items such as those listed on the screen. It may make sense to jump in by providing updates through risk committees, compliance meetings, and audit committee sessions to start. We'll talk about an aligned assurance committee here shortly when we talk about maturity in the future. However, I would start by bringing your findings to these groups. Recommendation number 4 is coordinating risk assessment timing between enterprise risk management, internal audit, and compliance. So, more than likely, as you go back to your organization and begin implementing these topics, you're going to be jumping in midstream. And midstream meaning right into an established work plan. So as we think about how to improve this process for the future, we need to start having discussions about risk assessments now, because risk assessment, again, is ultimately the foundation for all of the activity we're going to address. So you need to start having those discussions today. And I think I've already mentioned this, but we're not cutting out individual risk assessments altogether. We just need to have discussions about how to possibly leverage some of the same meetings that are already taking place, how to get on the same page about definitions for risk, and how to start thinking through shared methodology. This is step number 1 as we think towards development of future work plans. And finally, recommendation number 5 is actually my favorite. We need to start focusing on insight, not perfection. So again, all of this is about open communication. I do not recommend that you sit around and wait for all of the pieces in this aligned assurance puzzle to come together before you functionally start jumping in and addressing aligned assurance. You need to start today, and you need to start somewhere. It's certainly not going to be perfect, but you need to start by having open discussions. And so finally, in terms of implementation, I'll give you a taste of what an aligned assurance committee could look like based on my own experiences. So imagine a monthly meeting carved out dedicated time to aligned assurance. So we're going to be bringing cross-functional leaders, such as those from finance, risk, compliance, and internal audit, to the same table. There's going to be a set agenda, as we typically already mentioned. Internal audit is likely to provide that ahead of time. The agenda is going to be fixed, and we're going to have the same updates each meeting. Again, I recommend monthly. Quarterly also works very well. But we should be covering items such as progress on your existing work plan. What have you done to date? You are also going to cover what's set to kick off next. This should be a key step for others to listen and tune into on what you're about to start working towards and through, and whether or not there's an ability to start planning through future alignment activities. You also need to use this forum to start talking through what risk items have popped up that were unexpected. So if you have key findings or risks that are popping up, this is the appropriate venue to start talking through these items because, again, one of the outcomes is that we should be able to, on the fly, adjust our work plans to address risk where we actually see risk occurring. And so, as a result of these functional meetings, you likely are set to see some additional follow-up tactical calls after the fact. So we're going to have tactical calls that ultimately discuss how to leverage one another's work, again, avoiding duplication. We're also going to adjust scope, typically, based on these discussions occurring and where we see risk. We're also going to have coordination on evidence and testing that's already been completed. You, in some cases, can take your existing report that you may have issued months ago and provide it for context to another party so that they have a better starting point before they jump in cold. And finally, greater awareness and visibility onto what is taking place as far as ongoing activities across the organization. And at this point, I'm going to pause for polling question number 2.
Thank you. All right, our second question is, which challenge most often results from uncoordinated assurance at your organization? Duplication of work, conflicting conclusions, gaps in coverage, excessive information requests to business and/or finance teams, limited insight for leadership. Remember, you must answer the polling questions to receive CPE credit. You will have approximately 30 seconds to answer. All right, thank you for participating in our poll. Back to Andrew.
All right, so I've had a chance to digest the results as they've come in no shock. Challenges most faced by you all would be duplication of work. About half of you said this is existing in your current organization, as well as excessive information requests to business and finance teams. So those are the 2 leading challenges. So we started this discussion with a problem statement supported by data. As we move into the benefits, and ultimately this is our last section, I want to wrap up with some additional statistics from those who have actually implemented aligned assurance to date. And so on the screen, I'm sharing results from a survey performed earlier this year. And one of the key parties of this survey was the Institute of Internal Auditors, the IIA. And so again, this involved heavy participants from internal audit and enterprise risk management. So 90% of those who responded to the survey acknowledged positive outcomes from coordination between internal audit and risk management. That's a great percentage and outcome from some of this initial effort. And so as we move to the middle, I'm going to acknowledge that these percentages are by no means overwhelming. However, they are a starting point. So the top reported benefits of coordination were, no surprise, these all tie back to what we've already established, but improved risk coverage, reduced duplication of effort, stronger organizational alignment, and enhanced board communication. And finally, 60% of respondents expect to see further integration between internal audit and risk management in the next 5 years. So if I step back and think about this big picture, what this tells me is Again, starting back with the problem statement, it's not that organizations don't know what they're supposed to be doing, it's that they actually struggle with the implementation. And so, as this is becoming more of a relevant topic, 90% of people are saying they're seeing a positive outcome and they see the benefit and are going to continue to implement this in the next 5 years. So naturally, as we look towards the middle 4 boxes, I would expect each of these percentages to rise in the coming years. And personally, I'm very interested to follow progress as continued surveys are released. So let's jump into direct benefits at the governance level. So we've invested time and energy in the future to implementing aligned assurance. What do we set to ultimately gain at a governance level? So we're going to have a better feeling for risk appetite. Again, we have better data and we have better unified vision of risk. So ultimately, the organization at the governance level is going to have a better ability to say, ultimately, this risk fits within our defined risk appetite, or it sits outside of what we're comfortable with. And when it sits outside of what we're comfortable with, we're going to have better data as to what to ultimately do to mitigate that risk. We also are going to have a better ability, as we established, to allocate resources. This is going to cut down on conflicting resource requests. We're going to have one unified risk that paints a common picture, and obviously we're going to target our resources directly to those areas. Also, we're going to be able to target strategic initiatives. So as we established, when we talk about activity-based assurance, which unfortunately means more check-the-box activities, we're simply, in some cases, repeating the same activities over and over each year, regardless of whether or not that's where risk lives. So naturally, there are items that pop up throughout the year. Specifically, what comes to mind for me would be mergers and acquisitions, as well as system conversions. We actually, as assurance providers, can jump in and start partnering with groups to proactively address risk in these areas once we have a better feeling for risk, where risk lives. And finally, I do want to bring CFO into this perspective, but ultimately, as we're assessing risk on an ongoing basis and ultimately coordinating all of our activities, we should anticipate seeing fewer late cycle surprises. So hopefully, as a result of this, we should avoid getting to the end of the year and learning about major control issues that ultimately are going to impact our financial reporting. Next, we'll work through the benefits as we think through those providing business advisory. So what many people don't realize about internal audit is that a strong component of internal audit and should be baked into internal audit's work plan is actually business advisory. So while internal audit, once again, cannot operate controls, they can advise upon those controls proactively. So this is a complete shift from coming in after the fact and saying, this is broken, to having upfront discussions about how to get ahead of things before they become a true issue. So as we work to reclaim capacity for assurance providers, especially those in internal audit, we need to start thinking about where is time better spent? And ultimately, you're going to reclaim capacity through eliminating redundant testing and duplicative requests at the end of the day. And again, internal audit, a strategic advisor. This is a concept shift from the traditional work plan, but it's going to be monumental as organizations address some of the emerging risks that I'm going to bring up on the next slide. And then we're going to have a broader impact across the business. So once we start breaking down silos, we are going to have a much deeper view of what risk looks like and how to proactively get ahead of those risks across the entire organization. And then hand in hand with that, we are going to see proactive flagging of risks to areas such as financial reporting and other key areas before they go live. This goes back to items such as system implementations and conversions. We're sitting down with and partnering with the business before things become an issue later on. And ultimately, we start to coordinate on items such as timing and scope. And so finally, we ultimately should be seeing a better and more proactive way to address risks that are popping up throughout the year. And so what I have listed on this screen are common risks that maybe don't neatly fit into an existing work plan, but need time and energy spent on them. So we have AI and automation. AI is unique because it both introduces additional risk for an organization, but also provides an opportunity to more closely and appropriately and accurately address and assess risk. So this is something that needs to be tackled. I know that every organization and almost every role is struggling with what to do with AI on a daily basis. And so ultimately, we're going to have more time to spend on items that are up and coming, like AI and automation. Same thing with cybersecurity and data privacy. And I'm going to go ahead and tie in rapid regulatory change here. These areas are constantly evolving on a monthly, quarterly, and annual basis. We have things that are in the works, but maybe pop up suddenly. So again, we need the ability to pick up and address this risk proactively as it's coming up in order to provide the most benefit to our leadership. And finally, again, we need to talk about aligned assurance as an emerging risk advantage. So when we implement all of these efforts, we're going to have shared risk language on new threats. So we're going to classify our new threats on a consistent basis from day one once we implement these activities. We are no longer going to lose time with translating across the various frameworks. We're going to have a cross-functional forum, such as an aligned assurance committee, in which we can start to see early signs of areas that we may need to focus on. We're also going to begin to coordinate response plans to prevent duplication of work and gaps that pop up throughout the year. And then finally, leadership is going to receive one unified view of risk instead of conflicting interpretations. We're going to use existing data and we're going to marry this together in a much better way. And so with that said, I'm going to go ahead and pause for polling question number 3.
All right. Our third and final question is, what is the biggest barrier to implementing aligned assurance at your organization? Lack of a shared risk language across functions, lack of leadership support, resource constraints, unclear roles and responsibilities, or unsure where to begin. Remember, you must fill out the polling questions to receive CPE credit. You will have approximately 30 seconds to answer. Thank you for participating in our polls. Now back to Andrew.
So what your results ultimately tell me is that the biggest barriers are resource constraints, followed by unclear roles and responsibilities. So we have limited resources to throw at issues, and we also have unclear expectations and defined roles and ways that we're supposed to be approaching these issues. So aligned assurance at the end of the day should work towards solving these issues. However, again, it all starts with the upfront coordination piece. You have to start somewhere. You need to define what you're working towards and how you're going to get there. And so at this point, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up on today's discussion. And if you take nothing else from today, I want you to take these 4 key points. Working in silos ultimately is going to cost every function. It's the duplicated effort, inconsistent conclusions, and the blind spots that it's going to create. Key takeaway number 2 is that alignment ultimately strengthens each function's distinct role. So again, we're not looking to tear down any of those lines of defense, the barriers between them. Instead, we're looking to strengthen individual roles within a given function. The third point is that every stakeholder ultimately benefits from aligned assurance. Again, leadership is going to get a unified view, and each group is going to gain efficiency, visibility, and influence. And then finally, you need to start where you are at today. Again, do not wait for all of these pieces to neatly fall in line in one complete picture. You need to start today. You need to set up some discussions, and you need to start before it's perfect. And as I've used and referenced various surveys and materials today, here at the end of the presentation, we ultimately have listed those out in case you are curious about where the information came from and want to do your own independent research. I will acknowledge that the IIA, as listed on the screen, has some wonderful material that you should leverage as you begin to do your own independent research. And so at this point, I want to thank you all for tuning in on my presentation about aligned assurance.
Thanks to our presenter, Andrew Sizemore. Later today, you'll receive an email with a link to access his contact information, copies of the slides, and a recording of the webinar. If PYA can help you with audit, tax, compliance, valuation, or transaction services, please contact us. You may also visit our website at pyapc.com for more details of our specific areas of expertise and to subscribe to receive PYA insights. Please remember to stay on the line once the webinar disconnects to complete the short survey for CPE credit, and once complete, your CPE certificate is downloadable via the CPE pane. Our webinar coming up next is the One Big Beautiful Bill Impacts, Medicaid Cuts and State Tax Implications with Ramsey Fidel and Patrick Birmingham at 2:30 Eastern. If you have not yet registered, please use the link provided or visit the Thought Leadership section at pyapc.com. On behalf of PYA, thank you for joining us. We hope you'll rejoin us shortly for session 2 of PYA's Summer CPE Symposium, Hot Topics in Healthcare. Have a great rest of your day.